Hey there, let's talk rules. Those things we're told to follow, sometimes without even knowing why.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're diving into how those rules, or even just the idea of them, can really mess with how we figure out who's responsible when things go wrong.
It's a fascinating area of research. We're looking at a paper by Levin-Goover and Marcus Neer that digs into what they call the norm effect.
Okay, norm effect. Break that down for me.
Basically, it's the human tendency to see a broken rule and kind of jump to the conclusion that the rule breaker must be to blame for whatever bad thing happened, even if that rule had nothing to do with the outcome.
So it's like my cat trips over my guitar cable, making me hit a wrong note, and I blame the cat for not following the no walking on musical equipment rule, even though it's a cat.
Precisely. Our brains love to find a reason for things, and blaming the rule breaker offers a very tempting shortcut. Goover and Neer designed a series of experiments to see just how strong this effect is, even with totally nonsensical rules.
All right, I'm intrigued. Walk me through how they actually studied this. What did the experiments involve?
They presented over 2,500 participants with various scenarios where an action led to a negative outcome. Sometimes a rule was broken, sometimes not, and the rules themselves ranged from relevant to completely ridiculous.
Okay, let's get specific. Give me an example.
Imagine a music festival. One scenario describes a stage manager, Lauren, who launches colored powder into the crowd. Suddenly, it ignites because of a lit cigarette, injuring several people.
Ouch. Sounds like someone wasn't paying attention to the no smoking signs.
Right, but that's the thing. In some versions of the story, there was no rule against smoking at all. In others, a no smoking sign was clearly visible, making it a pertinent norm violation.
Pertinent meaning it was directly related to the fire. So in those cases, people probably pointed the finger at the smoker pretty quickly.
Absolutely. When a rule was broken that directly related to the outcome, participants judged the smoker as far more responsible, more deserving of blame, even harsher punishment.
That tracks. Rules exist for a reason,
Right.
right? But what about those nonsensical rules you mentioned? Do those actually have any impact?
This is where it gets really interesting. They introduced what they called non-pertinent and silly norms to the mix.
Okay, I'm all ears. What exactly makes a rule silly in this context?
Well, they used two types. Rules entirely unrelated to the outcome, and those that were just plain absurd. For example, one scenario involved a rule against being topless at the festival, which our smoker, let's call him Mark, violated.
All right, Mark, living life on the edge. But I gotta ask, how could a dress code possibly cause a fire?
You'd think it wouldn't matter, right? But here's the kicker. Participants still rated Mark as more responsible for the fire when he was shirtless, even though the dress code had absolutely nothing to do with it.
Wait, seriously? Come on, people can't be that quick to blame. That just doesn't make sense.
It highlights just how strong this blame bias can be. We're so driven to find fault that sometimes we twist the facts to fit our judgment.
All right, that's wild. But it gets even weirder with the silly rules, right? You said they took it even further.
Oh, they absolutely did. In another version, the festival organizers were attempting to set a world record for everyone wearing green caps. Mark, however, decided to ditch his cap.
So now he's a fashion rule breaker and a record breaker. This Mark guy is a walking contradiction.
But once again, when that powder ignited, participants saw Mark as more responsible for the fire because he wasn't wearing the silly green cap. It's like our brains have trouble separating the act of rule breaking from the act of blaming, even when the rule itself is completely nonsensical.
This is blowing my mind. So even a rule about green caps, something that has absolutely nothing to do with fire safety, made people more likely to blame Mark for the accident.
It did. And this is where the study challenges some existing theories about how we determine responsibility. One theory, the responsibility view, suggests that we link cause and effect based on our moral judgments. We decide who's morally responsible first, and then work backward to explain why they caused something.
So in this case, if someone believes that breaking any rule, no matter how small or ridiculous, is morally wrong, they'd automatically see that person as the cause when something bad happens.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
But the findings from the study suggest something more complex might be happening.
Okay, so if it's not just about morality and causation, what explanation are these researchers proposing?
This is where the bias view comes in. It argues that our inherent urge to blame can actually distort our judgments of cause and effect. Instead of a rational step-by-step thought process, our brains take a shortcut. Someone messed up, so they must be the cause.
Like a cognitive leap of faith fueled by our desire to point the finger. But isn't that a bit simplistic? I mean, sure, we all enjoy a good blame game now and then, but we're a little more nuanced than that, right?
You're right to question that. It's not like we're always driven by this bias, and the researchers recognize that. Remember how they designed the study with both silly rules and rules directly related to the outcome, like
Yeah.
the no smoking sign versus the green caps?
Right, right. They covered all the bases.
Exactly. And that's key, because even when the rule was pertinent, meaning it directly related to the fire, there was still evidence of this blame bias creeping in.
Wait, really? But if someone is breaking a rule specifically designed to prevent the exact bad thing that happened, isn't it fair to say they bear a greater responsibility?
It is. And the study did find that people were much more confident in blaming the rule breaker when the rule was relevant. But here's the fascinating part. The researchers argue that even in those cases where the rule is clearly important, the blame bias might be amplifying our judgments.
It's like the bias is acting as a volume knob on our judgment rather than just an on-off switch. We're more likely to blame someone when they break a relevant rule, but our desire to blame might make us crank up the severity of that judgment beyond what's actually justified.
Precisely. It's a subtle but crucial distinction. It doesn't mean our judgments are completely irrational, but it suggests that even when we're making sensible connections between rules and outcomes, this bias can still creep in and muddy the waters.
I see. So it's not just black and white. It's a complex interplay of factors.
Exactly. And this is what makes this research so compelling. It raises more questions than it answers, but those questions are important to consider.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could become a real problem, especially in situations where these judgments of responsibility carry serious weight, like, see, in a courtroom.
You've hit on a critical point. This study directly addresses the potential implications of the norm effect in legal contexts. Think about it. Juries are often tasked with determining who caused harm and to what extent they are responsible. If our judgments are being swayed by this blame bias, even subtly, it could lead to unfair outcomes.
So someone could be unfairly punished, not because they were truly the most responsible party, but because they happened to break a rule, even if that rule had little to do with the actual harm caused.
That's the danger this research highlights. It's not about excusing negligence or saying that rules don't matter, but it raises important questions about how this bias might be affecting our legal system and whether we're doing enough to mitigate its influence.
Okay, that's a pretty sobering thought. So if this blame bias is so deeply ingrained in us, is there anything we can do about it? Or are we doomed to forever misjudge situations based on our desire to find fault?
Well, for one, awareness is key. Just knowing about this bias can help us take a step back and examine our own judgments more critically.
That makes sense. Like the next time we see someone break a rule, even a small one, and something goes wrong, we can at least ask ourselves, am I really seeing this situation clearly, or am I letting my blame bias take the wheel?
Exactly. Question your assumptions. Ask yourself, is the rule truly relevant to the outcome, or are you drawing a connection just because it feels satisfying to blame the rule breaker?
So it's about hitting the pause button before passing judgment. And speaking of pausing, while we're hitting the pause button on passing judgment, it makes me think about the different ways we encounter information. In the study, people read about these scenarios. What happens when they can directly compare a rule breaker to a rule follower? Did Goover and Gneer look into that at all?
They did. In another experiment, they presented almost 300 participants with two versions of the same scenario side by side. One version always showed a rule violation, and the other didn't.
So instead of just hearing about Mark and the green cap, you'd see him right next to someone who followed the rule and could directly compare what happened. That seems like it would make it way harder for the blame bias to sneak in.
You would think so, right? And in many ways, you'd be correct. When participants could see both versions side by side, those non-pertinent and silly norms like the dress code or the green caps suddenly lost their power. The effect practically vanished.
Okay, that's reassuring. It's like our brains are able to be more objective when we have all the information laid out clearly in front of us. But what about when the broken rule was directly related to the outcome, like the no smoking sign? Did that still have an effect even when people could compare the scenarios directly?
This is where things get even more interesting. Even with the side-by-side comparison, that pertinent no smoking sign continued to influence how people judged responsibility.
So even when people could clearly see that the only difference between the two scenarios was the rule violation, they still held the smoker more responsible when there was a no smoking sign present. It's like our brains really, really want those rules to matter.
They do. And this is what makes studying the norm effect so complex. It suggests that there might be two things happening simultaneously. First, we have that automatic knee-jerk reaction to blame rule breakers, especially when the rule seems irrelevant. But then when we stop to think about it more, that initial reaction lessens. At the same time, we have this deeper belief that following rules does matter when it comes to cause and effect, especially when those rules are pertinent to the situation.
So it's not just a simple bias, but also a reflection of our genuine belief system. We're not just looking for someone to blame. We're trying to make sense of the world around us, and rules help us do that.
That's a great point. It's not black and white, but rather a complex interplay of our desire to make sense of things and our inherent biases. And as this research shows, that interplay can have a real impact on our judgments and decisions.
It makes you wonder then,
Mm.
what can we do with this information? What does it mean for how we approach situations where rules have been broken and consequences follow?
It highlights the importance of careful critical thinking. It reminds us to pause and consider all angles, especially when the stakes are high, like in legal settings.
So the next time we're tempted to jump to conclusions about who is to blame, we should ask ourselves, is it truly their fault? Or is our blame bias nudging us in a particular direction? Maybe that urge to blame is pointing to a deeper need to understand why rules are there and what purpose they serve.
Absolutely.
Right.
By recognizing our own biases and seeking a deeper understanding, we can make more informed and fair judgments and create a world that is more just and equitable for everyone.
Well said. It seems our deep dive into the world of rules blame and the surprising power of the norm effect has given us a lot to think about. Thanks to you all for joining us today. And remember, keep those minds curious, question those assumptions, and keep exploring the fascinating world of human behavior.